So for the folks on Zoom, we have a decent number of you here. So if you can all remember to keep your microphones muted, that is helpful to avoid some of the extraneous noise and everything from our folks at home. If you have questions, please type those in the chat on Zoom, where then we can see the questions there, and I will relay those to the presenter. For the folks in the classroom, as you have questions, the people on Zoom can only hear what's spoken into a microphone. So when you have a question, please wait for the coordinator to bring the microphone to you. And now I will turn it over to the coordinator.
Good afternoon, everybody. Mike Connor is a certified arborist, nursery grower, and has been a beekeeper for 55 years. A graduate of Cornerstone University with a BA in religion and a BS in biology. He did postgraduate studies in horticulture at Michigan State University. Mike became a branch manager of a national bee supply manufacturer in 1977. In 1985, he started his own tree nursery and operated 200 hives of bees, including a 7-year commitment as a municipal arborist and park superintendent in Plainwell, Michigan. Mike has spent his entire career growing and caring for plants, trees, and bees. He is a co-founder of the Grand Rapids Bee Club and is on the legislative committee for the Michigan Beekeepers Association. And with that, I'll let you take it over. Thank you, Mike.
Okay, thank you, Carol. Thanks for that introduction. My name is Mike Connor, and I am those things she said. I know I don't look like I've had bees 55 years, but I started really early. I know quite a bit about bees and trees, and that's my passion. And thanks for the opportunity to share that with you today. I actually met Carol a couple of years ago when she had a sick maple, and I think we've got it under control. So that's how I met Carol. Okay, well, let's start. As she said, I've been a beekeeper for a long time. I got my first hive in 1966. You guys can do the math. And I built that up to 200 hives of bees. I got my first hive of bees from Sears Roebuck, ordered it through the mail, got my hive, found a mentor down the road, and grew up on an orchard Christmas tree farm. So we had a lot of interaction with bees and nature as I was growing up. And then after I graduated, I became a manager of a national bee supply company, and it's where commercial beekeepers would come in and pick up bee supplies. That was in Grand Rapids. A little bit of history, it's kind of interesting, is that where the Gerald R. Ford Museum is today used to be a beekeeping manufacturing company called the A.G. Woodman Company. And we were kicked out so the Ford Museum could go in, and we moved our branch down to Wayland, closer to where I was living. And I ran that for 7 years, left on good terms to start my own nursery, to be full-time in my own nursery. So, and then of course the bee club stuff that we started in Grand Rapids, and that bee club now has standing room only at our club meetings. We meet once a month, and that's been a real good program that we started, is to get people who are interested in bees, to get them educated. Really, first off, on why not to get bees. Don't get them because you think you're going to make a lot of money on them. Don't think you're helping the bees by having bees. That's like having chickens to help the Kirtland warbler. You know, you get bees because you want the experience of having bees. So we're going to talk about bees today. I'm also a nursery grower, have been for a long time, since 1985, basically full time. We've really downsized a lot, almost to nothing now, because I can't find help. My average age of my crew last year was 73. So that helps you understand. So we've just decided to cut way back. These big trees are a real bear to handle. And what I do for a living really is I'm an arborist. I'm a tree physician. I'm not a tree mortician. We don't take trees down, but we go in and we try to keep trees alive. That's our goal. So we treat a lot of trees. That tree that you see on the left, that's an ash tree with emerald ash borer. That spruce tree has, does anybody know? No, it's gypsy moth. Gypsy moth. Yeah, they also love blue spruce. And people will see that. And a tree guy will come in with his pickup truck and say, ma'am, that tree is dead. And he'll cut it down. I'll go, no, we just need to get rid of the gypsy moth. So that's a difference. And then I'm teaching that photo of me down here. I'm teaching a pruning class for the city of Granville. And on the right, we're rescuing a tree that had soil compacted around it. We're able to get that tree to survive. So let's talk about bees. My passion is honeybees, but generally what I want to talk about is bees in general. When I talk about honeybees, you can assume that what's good for honeybees is good for our native bees. What's good for our native bees is good for our honeybees. There are exceptions to that. There are some plants that honeybees don't like, and there are a lot of plants that our native bees don't like. But generally, they're kind of interchangeable. From a beekeeper standpoint, though, this is the data that you want to see. Honeybees, as you know, have issues. Last year in 2020, 2021, we lost 51% of our bees in the state of Michigan. This is data from Bee Informed Partnership, which conducts surveys in all the states. Nationally, it was about 45%. Michigan was higher than that with 51%. We lose a lot of bees. If these were cows, if these were apple trees, if these were anything else, people would be even more alarmed because they would say, you're losing half your cows every year? How can you sustain yourself? Well, it's really becoming that way with honeybees. We're able to take a colony that's alive, that survives, and split that colony into two, but we do that at the cost of honey, okay? So our honey crops are going to suffer because we have to increase our colony count. Beekeepers are really resilient. We have ways of getting our colony counts back up at the end of the year. But then we go into the winter and we lose another 51%. So this is a real problem in Michigan and across the whole country. Well, what's going on with the bees? Why? I have something. Excuse me just a moment. What's the biggest problem that we run into with bees today? It's this thing. This is the varroa mite. This is a scaled version to a human of what would go on a honeybee. And these things get on honeybee larvae, they get on the adults at certain parts of the year, and of course they feed by sucking their body fluids out. Now, if I had one of these on me, it'd be really annoying. But if I'm a honeybee and it's on my back, I can't reach it. I can't pull it off. I can't bite it off. And if I have 3 of these on me, now I'm even in more serious condition. And what's worse is they're like malarial mosquitoes, except they're not just transmitting malaria type viruses. They are now transmitting, these mites are now transmitting, probably more than 20 or 25 different viruses when they suck on the honeybee. So it may not be that loss of serum in the honeybee that's killing the bee, but it will be one of these many, many viruses that are now attacking the honeybees. So these things are bad. We are no longer just beekeepers, we are mite keepers. If we don't control the mites, we can't keep bees. Every colony of bees in Michigan either has these or will have these, and they will kill the colony unless you do something to treat them. That's just the way it is. Oh, and feel free if you have any questions along the way. That's okay. Yes. What's the difference between a honeybee and a bee? Yep. When I use honeybee and bee, it's pretty interchangeable with me. This varroa mite does not affect our native bees. Right. And native bees, we have more than 450 different species of native bees in Michigan. This doesn't affect them, but a lot of the diseases that this thing transmits can be transmitted onto our native bees through other methods. And a lot of the other diseases that are affecting honeybees do affect our native bee populations, especially our bumblebees and mason bees. So let's continue here. Other diseases that we get, when I was first getting into bees, this was the one we watched out for, American foul brood. It's a bacterial infection, and it liquefies the larva of the honeybee while it's in the colony. And then it sends out spores and it gets transmitted. It's transmitted easily by dirty gloves or moving them from hive to hive or moving bee equipment from hive to hive, easily transmitted. This is the one we always used to worry about. And now we hardly even talk about it because of this guy. And back in the day, the treatment for American foul brood was you burn them. And we used to have in Michigan a series of inspectors. They were usually high school teachers who were looking for a summer job, and the state would send them out with a vehicle and say, here, inspect these bees for disease. And many of them didn't know what they were doing, unfortunately, and created a lot of trouble with the beekeepers. We had to register our hives with the state, their locations. That was the law. And the bee inspector had a right to come into your yard at any time. And I came home one day from work and there's my bees on fire. Didn't talk to me, didn't ask me, didn't confirm anything. He has just pushed my bees into a pile, thrown on some gasoline and set them on fire. Never knew if I had foul brood or not. So that kind of action created a lot of animosity between the state and the beekeepers. So the state got rid of the inspection program. Well, we've kind of modified that and we have inspection, but it's voluntary. And it's for beekeepers who take their bees out of the state. California requires a inspection of your bees before you can move your bees in for pollination. So it's kind of a hit and miss. So diseases, of course, the other problem that you're all familiar with, besides pests, are pesticides. This is not the number one problem with keeping bees or having bees or native bees in Michigan. Diseases and pests are. This can be a serious problem, but generally the farmers who apply the majority of pesticides are very aware of the pollination needs in the area, the orchard growers, et cetera. We have some new discoveries as honeybees have gone into almonds for pollination. They've discovered that a lot of the fungicides that are applied to flowers, the bees carry those fungicides back to the hive. It's fatal to the bee larva because honeybees, for instance, and bumblebees, they feed their larva with a fermented product. It's a mixture of nectar and pollen, and it ferments, and it's called bee bread. Well, if you add fungicide to it, it can't ferment. So you can have an exposure to a fungicide and weeks later your bees die off because your larva can't develop, they can't live. What we found is the biggest problem with pesticides is not the commercial guy, but it's her. Going out and having her lawn sprayed or spraying it herself, or notice her safety equipment. Notice her mask, notice her eye protection, notice her hand protection, and love the shoes. So she's out applying pesticides, and I guarantee if the label says use 1 tablespoon per gallon, she's using more. And so she's contaminating the environment, getting rid of, whatever pests she has, not following the label directions. This is a bigger problem for beekeepers. It's having a lawn service come in and spray your lawn for dandelions when they're in full bloom, or get rid of the clover when it's in full bloom. That's deadly to the honeybees and our native bees. Okay, come on. There we go. So it's not just the pests and pesticides, but the real thing that I focus in on is its forage and nutrition. Bees don't have enough food to eat. That surprises you. They don't have enough food to eat. They don't have the proper amount. They don't have the right mixture. They don't have it available when they need it. Okay, big cornfield. This is pretty typical of Michigan. Big cornfield, what's a bee going to eat if it's living in this area? Do bees work corn? Actually, come on. Actually, they do. They'll gather pollen off of the tassels and take it back to the hive. Now, put on my arborist hat. When a plant has resources that are being utilized, it allocates its resources very carefully. This is a key component. So if you're going to put out pollen and you're going to let the wind blow it across the countryside, you don't want to have a lot of your resources in it. There are two things that are important to plants: carbon and water. Whether you're a corn plant or a maple tree, carbon and water are very, very important. Lack of carbon, lack of water, and you'll die. So if a plant has to take the carbon to make protein that gets blown away, how much carbon is it going to use? It's going to use as little as possible. It wants to put out a minimal amount of protein. So if it's a minimal amount of protein and the bee's taking it back to the hive, how much good is it doing the hive? Not much. Actually, to the honeybee, a cornfield is nothing more than a desert. They're gathering this pollen. There's no nectar. They're bringing the pollen back. It's so low in nutrition. It only contains a few of the essential amino acids that bees need, and it's in small quantities. So the bees are like wasting their time. And just like you, if all a bee gets is inadequate nutrition, then all of these viruses that have been standing there waiting for your immune system to get weak, they can take over. So inadequate nutrition can result in sickness. We all know that's true. If you only eat one thing, it's not good. This is deformed wing syndrome. It's one of the viruses. When the bees become malnourished, then this virus often expresses itself. The bees can't fly. They leave the colony to go off to gather nectar, and they land at the bottom of the hive, and they can't fly. They're dead as far as the hive's concerned. Deformed wing virus. So what we need is a diversity of crops and a diversity of tree lines, diversity of plants in those tree lines. I'm a big advocate of these tree lines because they provide wildlife habitat, they provide wildlife corridors, they provide the majority of the nectar and pollen that your bees are going to collect. They provide nesting sites for most of your native bees. 60% of our native bees overwinter in the ground. And they've got to do that somewhere where they're not going to be disturbed. And the best place is along a tree line or on the edge of a woods. But unfortunately, tree lines and fence rows get in the way. I do a lot of work for a large dairy farmer down by Hickory Corners. He's a great guy, loves the land, truly loves the land. And back a few years ago when we had a drought and he's trying to feed 3,000 cows, we had a drought and his corn crop was lousy. His alfalfa field was lousy. So he invested millions of dollars in center pivot irrigation. And unfortunately, the tree lines got in the way. I actually had him in tears one day. I felt kind of bad, but not really. I said, what are you doing? What are you doing? And because he loves the land and he loves nature, we planted several hundred trees on his property to provide nectar and pollen for some that he had removed. In fact, we're working on another project for him right now, 4 new planting areas where we're planting pollen plants, nectar plants, and I'm really happy that he's able to do that. He has to set aside frame of mind that if it's not good enough for a crop, then it ought to be doing something for the wildlife. And a lot of farmers are that way. And this is what we're told. I took this photo at Grand Valley. Nope, I did not. Next photo was. But this is what we're told to do to help the bees, right? When you read in the magazines and you read in the articles, they say, well, plant some flowers, that'll help the bees. More on that later. These are 4 of my colonies taken photo I took a couple of years ago on March 31st. Let me tell you just a little bit about the biology of bees. Honey bees go through the winter as a colony, a group of bees. And the queen starts to slow down her laying of eggs until, mid-November, she's done. She's not going to lay any more eggs until January. Okay. So while she's not laying eggs, the colony cools down into the 50s, and they're not consuming a lot of food in the form of honey that's stored for the winter. But by the end of January, the sun is becoming, our daylight's becoming longer. The sun is coming up a little bit earlier, and that triggers the queen to start laying eggs. Well, if she's going to lay eggs, the other bees have to keep them warm. So they vibrate their wing muscles and they start consuming a lot more honey that's in the hive. And they raise the temperature of that hive from the 50s up into the mid 90s. And we can go around with monitors and we can see how a hive's doing just by doing a temperature reading of that colony. And we can see the size of the cluster, and it's really fun. That's kind of nice. So they are laying eggs because, again, I don't want to lose you on this, but those bees that are coming through the winter are not field bees. They are winter bees. They are not the bees that are going to go out next year and gather your honey crop. They are not the bees that are going to go and gather the nectar and the pollen that colony needs to get through to survive, in order to reproduce and to survive. It takes 2 million flower visits to make a pound of honey. Yeah, 2 million flower visits. So you got to have bees out there ready to work those flowers when they come out in the spring. Well, if your overwintered bees aren't designed to do that, the only bees that can do that will be new. Your new bees have to be 6 weeks old before they can go out. So it's actually 9 weeks, 3 weeks as an egg, they hatch, they pupate. Okay, that takes 21 days, 3 weeks. Then they spend the next 3 weeks in the hive as nurse bees taking care of other baby bees. And then they're going to spend, 6 weeks. So then they're going to spend the next 3 weeks of their life gathering nectar and pollen. So back it up a little bit. If it's mid-May and you've got bees that you want to pollinate or work your garden, or you want them to gather nectar and pollen from your apple trees and your cherry trees, those bees have to be laid 6 weeks earlier. Mid-May, back up 6 weeks, middle of March. Okay. How are we going to get baby bees to be laid the middle of March, especially this year? Well, this is the end of March 2 years ago. We're running behind, but this is April 28th of that same year. 1 month later, I'm into the hive. Boy, I couldn't do that today. I'm into the hive. All of this brown that you see right here, that's capped brood. Those are baby bees that are about to emerge as adults. And then they'll spend the next 3 weeks as a nurse bee, and then they'll go out and start gathering nectar and pollen. So all of this that you see right here is capped brood, baby bees. But if you can see it, look at all the bees with yellow on their legs, because they are bringing in pollen. It takes roughly a honeybee cell of pollen plus a honeybee cell of nectar plus a honeybee cell of water to make a bee. That's a lot of pollen they have to bring in. This is a photo I took on April 8th a couple of years ago. We would have seen this last Saturday when the temperature was warmer. You can see there are these bees bring in pollen on their back legs. And there are two different colors of pollen that they're bringing in. So I know that they're gathering pollen from two different sources. One is yellow and one is kind of a gray-green. What do you think on April 8th the bees are gathering that pollen from? Oh, you're so smart. That's right.
I'm just down south and the pollen is crazy down there.
Yeah. Almost everybody says without thinking, well, it's dandelions. Guess what? Dandelions aren't out yet. Dandelions are just beginning. Dandelions don't normally come out till the end of April. Bees need pollen and nectar by the middle of March. Well, what's that going to come from? They certainly need it by the 1st of April. By the way, this is interesting. We see yellow pollen coming in and we think, well, dandelions would be a logical source, but look at the color of the pollen that bees collect off of dandelions. Even though it's yellow on the dandelion, it's orange on the bee because it's so staticky. It's so dry. It's like those little static balls of styrofoam. You know, it clings to everything. So the bees pull it down, pull it through a special attachment they have, and they add nectar to it to make it wet. And by doing so, it turns it orange. That yellow pollen was coming off pussy willow. Pussy willow, very, very important source of nectar and pollen for bees of all kinds in the spring. One of the most important plants. Even there's a photo of native bee, one of our native bees on pussy willow. The second pollen that you saw, that gray-green pollen, was coming off of red maples. And by red maples, I don't mean the maples that have the purple leaves. I mean our native red maples that turn red or yellow in the fall, Acer rubrum. And they're very, very common. And when you see them, you know, you see this, you think, well, that's probably leaves coming out. Those are all flowers. Those are very early in the spring. In fact, our very first pollen that we receive in the spring comes off of silver maples. I think I left the slide in. I told Carol I had to get rid of half my slides because I tend to go too long if I have too many slides. Okay, I didn't bring it in, but silver maples a couple of years ago were in bloom in Michigan the last week of February. In my slides, I normally show, I have a photo of a silver maple in full bloom the first week of March that I took in Grand Haven. People don't even know they're in bloom. Silver maples don't require degree day accumulation like most plants. They just go, well, we've had sufficient chilling. Now that we've had enough chilling, first warm day, I'm sending out blossoms. And what's the advantage of that? You think about it. Why do I send out blossoms so early in the season? It's because they get pollinated and their seeds are mature by middle of May. They're falling off the trees the middle of May and they sprout. And now that silver maple has the advantage in any niche that it's in because it got pollinated that spring and it's going to be this big by fall, while its competitors are going, well, we're going to come out with our fruit now. It's going to sit on our tree all summer. It's going to have to go through the next winter, and then it's going to fall on the ground and it'll start to sprout. Well, by then the silver maples have got 2 years growth. So they really have learned how to take over an available niche. But how do they keep from freezing when they're putting out flowers early in the season? The answer is they surround the ovary with sugar water, natural antifreeze. And the bees are just scavenging that sugar water, large quantities of sugar water on silver maples and on red maples. Silver maples don't need insects for pollination. It's just the wind. Red maples, they're a little bit smarter. They come out a couple weeks later. They don't have to have insect pollination, but it sure helps. Okay. Red maples have got it all figured out. They can be wind pollinated, insect pollinated, and they have such a huge genetic diversity that I have grown from the same mama tree. I've grown red maples, and this progeny might be in bloom today, but this one, same size, same mom, might not bloom for another 2 weeks. Red maple blossoms are available in Michigan for whatever pollinators want to use them for a full 6 weeks. There's huge, huge genetic diversity. Plus, we have about 200 different cultivars available in Michigan that you can plant in your yard of red maples, red sunset, October glory. They're great landscape plants. The ones to avoid are the hybrids, like the Freeman varieties, because they're a cross between like a silver and a red, and they're bred that way to be sterile, so they don't drop the seeds. Therefore, they don't have any flowers. Or they don't have a flower, many varieties of Freeman, but they don't have a flower that a bee can benefit from. Okay, so red maples. Anyway, there are more than 2,000 species of plants in the Midwest that are visited by honeybees, but only a few produce nectar in sufficient quantity. And those flowers are sufficiently common that the bees can make surplus honey. So you see that photo. This is one that I did take at Grand Valley. And you think, I'm doing a lot of good for the bees. How much nectar is in there? What would you measure that as? Milligrams? Maybe picograms? I mean, the amount of nectar in this little pot is insignificant. It's a good thing. Don't not do it. It's probably good for some of the native bees that come out that just want a small drink. But if you really want to do something, you plant a tree. That tree, look at the number of blossoms compared to this little pot. And you know what? They have the same footprint in the garden. They're both this big around. This is one of my customers up in Grand Haven. Beautiful pollinator garden. Beautiful. It's good for the native bees. I like this. Honeybees are like, there's nothing there for me. They'll visit, but it's our native bees who will benefit from this. This is another project up in Grand Haven. This is at a retirement village. It's beautiful, but I want to check something here. Okay. Who has more blossoms? So seriously, think about this. You're going to plant a pollinator garden. Look at the number of blossoms. That's beautiful. And we are providing a lot of habitat for our native bees who can nest in the ground, nest in hollow twigs. This is fantastic. I don't in any way put this down. But if you're after sheer quantity and quality of nectar and pollen, I'll make it work. Squash this tree down, compress it, pancake it, spread it out. Who has more blossoms, that one tree or that field of pollinator flowers? Yes,
But it seems the drawback to the tree is it's a short-lived period.
correct.
So then what?
Then we have,
Like, repeat the question.
oh, she said the disadvantage of that would be that the flowers of the tree are only available for a short period of time. And she's absolutely right. That's why you have sequential trees that you will plant. Other trees that will flower later. You start with the red maple, the pussy willow. We'll get into that in just a moment. But great, thanks for asking that, because that is a concern. But you are providing more nectar and pollen on this one tree than we were providing in this beautiful pollinator garden. Okay, come on. There we are. So there was a study done by a guy named Dr. Wood at Michigan State. I got to be good friends with Dr. Wood. He's now in Europe. But for 2 years, he went around the entire state, and his research was to gather native bees, not honeybees, but native bees, because it was that's how his funding was coming through. And so he gathered native bees from every county in Michigan throughout the year for 2 years, brought them back to the lab, and he would brush off the pollen on those that had collected pollen, and he would see where was it from. Okay, great study, and he had it all time sequenced, so he knew what he got where and what were they working. Well, his research showed that, and this is really important, 26% of all the pollen collected in the month of April came from maples. Now, this includes all the other wildflowers. This includes everything else that was out there. But in the month of April, 26% of all the pollen collected by native bees was off of maples. And he didn't break it down into red maple, silver maple, Norway maple. Even more surprising is that 33% of all the pollen collected in April came off of pussy willow or willows in general. So 59% of all the pollen collected by our native bees was coming off of just 2 plants. And those plants are plants that we'll find growing in wetland areas. They are wild plants. They're everywhere in the state, but 59% was coming off of just these 2. That's really, really staggering information. Then he found that 24% of the pollen collected in the month of May is coming off of cherries and apples. Not just orchard cherries and orchard apples, but the ornamental cherries that we plant in our yard, the flowering crabapple that we have on the corner that cities plant. This is huge. A lot of our cherries, I didn't put the slide in here, but we have a cherry called a Mazard cherry, and it's everywhere in Michigan. And it is a sweet cherry that was brought over from Asia. It's where we derived our Bing cherry and our other sweet cherries. And it has become everywhere in Michigan. And you probably don't even notice them, but you'll see them in every fence row. You'll see them alongside buildings. And they're a full-size tree. And the fruit is good. It's about the size of your little fingernail. But the fruit's real sweet. It's real good. And it's a major player now for both bees and birds. And the birds gather these up in big quantities. They fly away. They go sit somewhere. They add fertilizer and they drop them. So we have them. We have these everywhere. So that's why I think cherries and apples are such a significant source of pollen and nectar. Then, of course, we have our own black cherries and native cherries that are adding to this too. It's interesting that next in June, it's brambles. Though brambles is loosely defined as anything that is viney, and as you walk through it, it grabs your feet. Okay, that would be the multiflora rose, that's the dewberry, that's the blackberry, raspberry, all those things that are growing when you're walking through a field and they're grabbing at you. Well, that's 8%. That was the real significant source of pollen in June. And this is another one, and that's sumac. Sumac is 18%. We think of this shrub that's growing on the side of the road and in ditches as just a weed, but to our bees, it's really, really important. Okay, here's that photo I took March 9th in Grand Haven. This is silver maple in full bloom. There's a close-up of its blossom. Yeah, they're really pretty. And I walked into a garden center one time, said to the owner, who now is a good friend, and I said to the owner, red maples are in bloom today. And he's going, red maples don't bloom. You know, yeah, they do. So 2 most important plants for spring buildup are maples, especially red maples, and the willows, especially the pussy willow. And then, of course, we go through the fruit trees, which would be orchards or ornamental. This is a Sergeant crabapple. I like a Sergeant crabapple. It's a dwarf crabapple because it's one of the very few crabapples that grows true to seed. So if you have one, you can take the fruit and plant it and it comes back up as a Sergeant crabapple. No, well, maybe there's one other crabapple that does that, but no apple tree does. You can't plant a Red Delicious and have it grow up as a Red Delicious. You know, their genetics is too diverse. They don't do that. You have a 1 in 4,000 chance, I think. But Sergeant grows and they're a great wildlife tree. This is a honeybee working a Sergeant crabapple. Photo I took. Amazing what our phones can do with photos. And let's talk about ornamental pear. I'll be right up front. I'm an arborist, I'm a nursery grower, and I hate these. I really don't like ornamental pears. They're pretty. They were pushed initially because they were fruitless. Lie. They would not be invasive. Lie. And they would provide food and nectar for wildlife. Lie. Now I'm finding that there's a new disease and it's called trellis rust, and it's in Detroit. It's moved towards Lansing now, and it will devastate these ornamental pears. It will kill them. And it's been in Michigan now for a couple of years. And the treatment for this is when they are in full bloom, you spray them with a fungicide. Oh, I hate that. I hate that. I won't spray your crab apples. I won't spray anything if there's flowers on it. I refuse. And for many years, as I looked at these ornamental pears, especially this one, which was real easy for me to look at, I'd look at it every year when it was in bloom, and I'm going, what's pollinating you? You have fruit. What's pollinating you? And I would look, and there'd be nothing. There'd be no native bees, there'd be no bumblebees, there'd be no butterflies, there'd be no bees. And then one morning, I was sitting on our deck. I hope I put this slide in here. I was sitting on my deck, and guess what? There's a honeybee working the ornamental pear next to my deck. So I really started observing and allocation of resources. These are not stupid pear trees. They provide nectar for just a brief window of time every morning from about 10 to 12. And when I started looking at ornamental 10 and 12, I would find not only honeybees, but native bees, sometimes by the thousands, just in that brief window of time. And then about noon, the pear says, whoop, that's it. Allocation of resources. But I'm going to leave my flowers up just in case you want to come and look, okay, and maybe pollinate it. I'm not going to offer you any reward, but come on and check me out. And, you know, a lot of our trees that we have in tropical regions do that. And we knew that. They have so many flowers that are in bloom at any one time. They don't have enough pollinators. So they kind of take turns in bloom. You know, the bees can go from this tree to this tree to this plant. So they're all kind of taking turns, and the pear is part of that. I think the pears realize, I'm not going to put out, I'm not going to waste energy. I'm not going to use up my carbon to make sugar and pollen, if you know, and just have it available all the time. It's not a smorgasbord. Come when I offer it. And of course, you can do a horrible thing with an ornamental pear. That Shipshawana. Those brambles, blackberries, are a major source of nectar and pollen for all of our bees, native and everything. Multiflora rose. I have had, okay, I won't mention any names, but he was recently in Grand Rapids doing a talk, and he's written books about native plants and pollinators and birds, and I like a lot of what he writes, but I actually had the opportunity to have lunch with him one day, and he told me that no, non-native bee, period, will ever work a non-native plant. Ever. And I said, how many photos do you want? I mean, do you think that a bee flies over everything and goes, are you native or non-native? No. The bee's going to go, do you have nectar? You know, do you have pollen? And he insisted, and he got up and called me an obscene name and left. And I've never forgotten that. And he was wrong. He was wrong. Multiflora rose is a non-native plant, and this is a native bee. That pear that I showed you was a non-native plant, and that was a native bee. Did I say that wrong? Yeah, native bee to a non-native plant. They don't care. They're just looking for lunch. Don't ever believe that bees will not work non-native plants. It's not true. They don't care. They don't look at the pedigree. I want to talk about sumac. When I say sumac, inevitably somebody says, isn't that poisonous? No, that's like saying a muskrat is a rat. It's not a rat. Poison sumac is not a sumac. It's got a stupid name. It's in an entirely different genus than our sumacs. It's in the cashew family. It's in the same family as poison oak, which grows out west, and poison ivy, which grows here. And it only, with no exceptions, grows with wet feet. It will never, ever grow in a gravel pit. It will never grow on the side of a ditch where its feet aren't underwater. Never, ever. Sumacs that we have growing in Michigan, unless it's in a swamp, eat it. Enjoy it. Let it go. Leave it alone. Upland sumacs all belong to the genus Rhus. We have 4 native sumacs in Michigan. One's in bloom today, and that's the fragrant sumac. Very insignificant blossom. One of its hybrids is often used in like at Home Depot and those types of things as a ground cover because it's real short. It's called grow low sumac, and that's a fragrant sumac. Pretty insignificant to the pollinators. But then we have smooth sumac, we have staghorn sumac, and then we have wing sumac that are all native, and they're all fantastic for the bees. This is smooth sumac. Sumacs come boys and they come girls. And so often you will see them in bloom where this is the girl and that's the boy. And they send out stolons that sprout up and they spread that way. Or sometimes we will have smooth sumac growing with staghorn sumac. Most people can't tell the difference except for blooming time. Smooths come out first. This is staghorn. Look at the bees working staghorn sumac. And it's different because there's smooth sumac, which doesn't have the hairs on the new growth. Okay? Staghorn has hairs. It's the best way to tell them apart. And then we have wing sumac, which is phenomenal. Smooth sumac, staghorn sumac, they bloom in May. Wing sumac will bloom in July. And I've been selecting them to bloom later and later. And now they're blooming in August and September when there's not much more available. So they're coming into full bloom and the bees just descend on them. If you can see this bee that's flying away, the pollen that she has on her back leg. It's an extremely productive sumac. A book that I read by Peter Littner, Garden Plants for Honeybees, he writes that it's the highest density of bees on flowers that I have ever observed is on this dwarf or winged or it has a lot of names, flame sumac. Yes. It depends where you grow it. I've seen them, according to the literature, they're not supposed to get much above 8 feet. but I have seen them 15, 20 feet. So dwarf, I think, is a misnomer. Yes.
Are they all a really invasive kind of a plant though? Because I had the first sumac.
The smooth.
And it just took over and their roots went all under a gardening berm area I had.
Yep. The question was, do all the sumacs, do they all colonize? Do they all take over? Do they all form big clumps? I would say in terms of aggressiveness, it would be staghorn is the most aggressive, and then smooth. And then the third least aggressive would be the flame or the wing sumac. They all form colonies, yes. In my own experience, I have never seen the wing sumac outgrow its bounds. Okay, easy to control. Easy to control with either mowing or anything else that you like cultivation. If it gets into a flower garden, it's easy to pull up and control. The smooth and the staghorn can be very aggressive. Yep, they'll take over whatever area you allow them to grow. Yeah, they really prefer well-drained, dry soil. All of the sumacs do. But they're so good for the bees. All right, and finally we reach the queen of all the honey plants that we have in Michigan, and that's American basswood. American basswood used to be our number 2 honey producer in the state. Now it's probably number 1. Number 1 used to be white sweet clover, but now it's American basswood. Potential is for it to produce 8 to 1,100 pounds, according to Wikipedia, of honey per acre. That's my source, Wikipedia. I don't know if anybody's actually gone out and measured the amount of nectar, but Wikipedia says so. And they have a real advantage in that they bloom the 4th of July. So all chance of frost is gone and their flower hangs down. So if we get a rain, we're not diluting the nectar. And they put a little umbrella over the flowers just to kind of protect them, keep the rain off. See these little umbrellas? It's called an umbrel. And they provide that over the flowers. And I don't know what the purpose is. So I just say it's to shade and to protect the bees while they're out there. That's the queen. Here's a close-up. I actually took this photo in a rain. You can see how wet the leaves are. And there were bees working this in full bloom during a rain because, again, they're pointing down and they have an umbrella. Really, really productive plants. Its cousin, the little leaf linden, is often planted as a street tree. I saw several just in my walk from the post office here. It's a great street tree. They're low maintenance and they're consistent in their blossoming. They bloom every year. Very, very well attended by pollinators. I'm on several tree boards and we make tree recommendations. I always recommend pollinator plants. But you don't say they're attractive to bees. You say they're attractive to pollinators. Everybody goes, "Aw, great." But the bees love them. No doubt. No doubt. Little leaf linden. Many varieties of little leaf. Here's a close-up of a little leaf linden in full bloom. Let me tell you a little bit of the difference. The American basswood is a linden. Okay, we call them lindens in Europe and they're called basswoods in America. But the American basswood will produce flowers, huge quantities of flowers, huge amounts of nectar, but they don't do it every year. It might be 2 out of 3 or 3 out of 4 years. And then they have to take a rest and they have to rebuild their resources for the next huge amount of resources are going to expend for the next, opportunity to breed. It's interesting that studies done in England show that they synchronize. So northern England, they're all in bloom this year. Middle of England, they might not be. But middle England will all be in bloom at the same time. So now we have the advantages of a lot of resources for the bees, a lot of fruit that gets set at one time. So as the squirrels and the birds come in to get the fruit, there's so much of it that some of it's going to survive. Acorns are the same way. Yes.
Curious, has there been a correlation study to see if the bees are increasing?
No, I think, oh, I'm sorry. She asked if there was a correlation between the number of bees and the amount of nectar available. Specifically with that, specifically with the linden, I would say probably not. I think this just lost opportunity. We lose an awful lot. I've got a good slide here coming up, but we lose an awful lot of nectar because there aren't enough bees to gather it all. They talk about competition between native bees and honeybees, and there are times of the year when you can't have enough bees to gather the nectar and the pollen that's available. So most of it just gets washed away. Little leaf linden. This is a silver linden. I love the silver linden. It's another European variety, but I love it because the underside of the leaves are white. They're white because they're covered with little fine hairs. Covered with little fine hairs, Japanese beetles don't touch them. So if you're in a Japanese beetle area and you want a linden tree, you plant a silver linden because they don't touch them. Yep, and they bloom early and they're beautiful. And I will say I have one planted outside in my yard. I have a lot of trees in my yard. And when these come into bloom, I don't even have to go outside. I know when it's in bloom because the fragrance is amazing.
I used to live in Lansing, and one day I was walking downtown and it smelled heavenly. Well, they planted linden downtown Lansing, and it's wonderful.
Oh, it is, isn't it? Yep, it's fantastic. So here's a fun fact. 2 mature basswood trees can produce as much nectar as an acre of sweet clover. So which one do you have room for in your backyard? If you want to help the bees, you want to provide food for the bees, which one fits in your backyard? Abundant flowers in large numbers. Okay, those plants that we've just talked about, how was our time doing here? Okay, okay, she said I've got 15 minutes, so I'll hurry. Locally significant trees, everything until now is available through the whole state of Michigan. Basswoods are in the Upper Peninsula. Basswoods are all around the state. Everything that I've shown you so far are pretty ubiquitous in Michigan, but we also have some very locally significant trees for our pollinators. Come on. One would be redbud. Redbuds are not visited much by our smaller bees. They are visited very, very heavily by our bumblebees and our carpenter bees, the larger bees. These will grow in large quantities along rivers, in lowlands. A single redbud tree is beautiful to look at. It's not doing much for the honeybees, but it's there for the bumblebees and our other native bees. I'm pushing the button, I promise. Close up of the blossom. They're really pretty. Okay, here's one that you love or you hate. This is the only native tree that is considered invasive on our invasive list. And I'm kind of torn up by that because it's a native tree. It's native to the Appalachians. It was brought up into Michigan for erosion control, Northern Illinois for coal mine reclamation. But it has worked its way up all by itself, and now it's a native tree in Michigan. But it's considered invasive, and if you see it, you're supposed to pull it out or destroy it or whatever. Unfortunately, in bloom, it's an incredible pollinator-friendly plant. Monarch butterflies, as they move up into Michigan, they love these black locusts. Honeybees love these black locusts. Native bees love the black locust. The only disadvantage of the black locust is it likes to colonize. And you can have one tree take up several acres as it sends out its roots and sprouts up and sends out its roots and sprouts up. And it used to be planted for nitrogen fixation. I plant these, forgive me, but I will plant these in a city coffin. A coffin is a cutout in a parking lot or in a sidewalk where nothing can grow. They don't care. You can abuse them. They've got these little tiny thorns on them, and if a kid grabs a hold of one, you go, let's go. It won't hurt the kid. They provide nectar and pollen for our bees and our butterflies. And if they're buried in a coffin, they're not going to spread. Okay, they're called coffins because the average life of a tree planted in a city sidewalk is 11 years. These things can live longer. So I'm guilty of that. If you mow around them, they're not a bad yard tree either. Another one, this is invasive, and I'm not going to tell you to plant this one at all. Another one that's really significant for bees is the autumn olive. I'm not a fan. Best management, however, would say if you're going to control these on your property, get rid of them after they bloom. Okay, so wait until they provided all the resources for your bees and your pollinators and your butterflies, and then you can chop them down or mow them off. It's the same way with like milkweeds. We're working with the Michigan beekeepers right now in order to come up with a best practice list that we can give to municipalities. Often you will see a beautiful field of milkweed just coming into bloom, and along come the city workers and they mow it down. Well, why? Or we'll see, like autumn olive in full bloom, and then they go in and spray it when it's in full bloom to kill it. Just wait a week. Let's get the resources out of it before we kill it. And by the way, trying to kill it is often really hard. You just make it mad. Chinese chestnuts in some areas, when these things are in bloom, they smell terrible. But I have been driving down the road before with the window down about the 4th of July, and I go, there's Chinese chestnuts. Because you can smell them and they stink. But the bees love them. And as to other pollinators, this is kind of a cool, this is a native to the Appalachians also. It's bottlebrush buckeye. This is a photo I took in Grand Haven. This plant's been in about 12 years at the time this photo was taken. Compare it in size to the car. This is a pretty impressive plant, and it has flower panicles. Are any of you familiar with them? It's an amazing plant. Flower panicles about this long, and every bee in the neighborhood, every butterfly that's around is going to go, I'm going after this one. Meyer Garden has a lot planted. It will grow in full sun. It grows in part shade. They have them planted underneath trees in their botanical gardens at Meyer Garden. It's a great shrub. It's not invasive. It doesn't take off. Yes. She's asking me if it's related to the bottle brush in Florida. And the answer is, I don't know. I'm not sure, but they have the long panicle. And she's saying that they come in fuchsia and pinks. Sounds interesting. I don't know if they're related or not, or if it's just a common name. Tulip poplar. This is an amazing plant too. Grows wild, gets to be huge, 100 feet tall. And they've got this really unique characteristic in that they're pointing up. Remember, the basswood's pointing down. If we get a rain, basswood doesn't care. If we have a flower that points up, we get a rain, it's problems. So they've figured that out. It's truly a teacup-sized blossom. And it's tight, tight, tight. And before it opens, it starts to secrete nectar around the base. So for several days before it opens, it's secreting nectar, and every bee and ant and insect is going, I'm going after that nectar. So the morning that it opens, the bees are already there. It opens up, the bees go in, they pollinate it. They produce so much nectar. This is a photo I took out by Saugatuck last year. They produce so much nectar that it drips right out of the flower. You cannot have enough bees to gather all the nectar that's available on a tulip poplar. We could take a spoon if we'd have had one. This kid was helping me. And we could have taken a spoon and dipped it out of those flowers. And it was kind of like carob syrup in consistency. Very, very sweet. And we can get it's called a monofloral crop, where you can get a full box of just tulip honey. And it's great. It's a little dark, it's not the highest quality, but there's so much out there available. And yep, it comes out in such quantities that it will turn the leaves white with sugar as it dries. So that's a good one to have and to promote. Yes.
How do bees get the nectar back to the hive? How is it sacs on their legs? But
The question is, how do they get the nectar back to the hive? They carry the pollen on their legs. They have a honey stomach.
so they ingest
They actually ingested it. And as they do, they're adding enzymes to it and they're beginning to convert that nectar into honey right away. When they arrive back to the hive, they regurgitate that to another bee who adds more enzymes to it, who then moves it into a cell. Then they evaporate it down to the right moisture, about 18%. A bee does not gather pollen and nectar. They divide that work into, your job is to go get pollen today. You don't get nectar. Your job is to get water. Your job is to get propolis. Your job is to get nectar. And they divide that up. Nobody knows how they do it. It's all chemical. The queen's not telling them. But they
so one bee might get pollen one day and nectar another day.
yes. Yep. But when they go out and start to gather resources, they don't cross purpose each other. And when they start working tulip poplar, they will stay on tulip poplar until they're done. They're not going to go from tulip poplar to dandelions. Okay. They're going to stay on tulip poplar until that resource is done. If they didn't do that, there'd be no pollination. They start working apples, they stay on apples. They don't go from apples to cherries. That way the apples get pollinated. So it's a real advantage for the plants that bees are loyal that way. There's a name for it. I forgot it. All right. Black gum, another decent tree. I kind of think this photo was taken on campus here somewhere. We had a class, but black gum, its cousin is Tupelo, where you get Tupelo honey. Nissa. There's a swamp variety of this that produces Tupelo honey, one of the highest quality honeys we have. And they're good for bees and pollinators. American holly, we have some along the lakeshore. Good for our pollinators. Another invasive, which is privet, ligustrum. We still plant them in Michigan. We can still do that. But down south, they've pretty well been outlawed because they become invasive. That photo on the right that you're looking at, that's pollen. So much pollen is being produced that it falls right off the flower. And the bees just go and gather it. They're just, hey, this is great. And they smell good too. When the privet's in bloom, that smells really good. They're not invasive in Michigan. We can still plant them, but down south, they're a real problem. In Georgia, they hate them. Buttonbush, another swamp growing shrub. Took this photo out at East Grand Rapids, and it blooms after the 4th of July. We break our nectar periods into 3 different categories. We have spring, we have summer, and we have fall. In the spring, most of the trees are producing nectar and pollen. The pussy willows, that list that I gave you, and it ends with the basswood, which starts the second group of plants, which will be the buttonbush, our forbs, such as white sweet clover, star thistle or spotted knapweed, major honey plants in that category. Then in the fall, we get into like goldenrod and aster. And we have some dearths now because we're controlling some of those like white sweet clover and star thistle. because they're invasive. Yeah. How tall do button bushes get? 12 feet. There's a variety put out by Proven Winners, and it's called Sugar Shack, and it gets to be about 6 to 8 feet. It's a real compact shrub, lots and lots of flowers, good for a rain garden, for instance. It likes wet soil. Yep. Sugar Shack is the cultivar. Cultivar means cultivated variety. But out in the wild, you'll see these 10, 12 feet tall, usually on the edge of swamps. Another photo. Really pretty flower. It's a collection of flowers. And each flower has to be pollinated to produce seed. Has to be pollinated by an insect. Not by the wind. Has to be an insect. So you count up those and you go, well, it wouldn't take long to get 1 million flowers. And another good landscape plant, if you're going to plant around your house, for instance, are the paniculata hydrangeas. The paniculatas are nectiferous. They produce nectar. The bees are attracted to that. The flat hydrangeas and the things like, I'm going to forget now, but a lot of the other common hydrangeas that we have are not productive for bees or any other pollinator. But the paniculata group and the oak leaf are very productive for our pollinators. Close up of, basically, if it's a hydrangea and it blooms in late summer, it's good. If it blooms in the spring, like Annabelle, or midsummer, it's, it's of no benefit. It's pretty to look at, but don't plant it for the bees. Look at the bumblebees working that. Because we have that dearth in August when there's not much else available, there are other trees that can help fill that niche. One is the Japanese pagoda. Japanese pagoda is not invasive. It's polite. It gets to be a large tree, and it's consistent in that it flowers every year. And it has almost a black locust type flower on it. Very, very attractive to pollinators. Look at the number of flowers on that tree. Again, think if you had to plant this in your yard, it doesn't take up that much space, and look at all the resources you're providing. Another one that I've really fallen in love with is a Seven Suns tree. They're still extremely hard to get. Do you know anything about them? Okay, she says she has one. She says the problem is they have a lot of bees. Amen. Amen. Yeah. Yep. The bark is beautiful, she said, and it is. Let me tell you a quick story about this. These weren't even discovered until the 80s. No, 1995, I think. They were unheard of. No one had ever seen one. They're completely unknown to the botanical industry. China. They found them in 5 different locations in China near the same mountain. Somebody had the smarts to do cuttings and gather some seeds and bring them back and propagate them. They went back to get more. Guess what? It's all agriculture. They're all gone. They are now extinct in the wild. Oh, I'm sure. I'm sure. They're a beautiful plant. Gorgeous plant. Yeah, hurry up. Okay, one last slide. One last slide, Seven Suns. After the white flower, then they have their calyx turns bright red. And that calyx stays on. This is a photo I took November 1st. It stays on until Thanksgiving. They're a beautiful plant. Yeah, here's a close-up. And then that bark you were mentioning is really pretty. So here's my conclusion. The largest potential nectar and pollen yield per acre is from trees. No doubt. Can't dispute that. What can you do? Walk around, pay attention, look, observe. What are the bees working? What are bees on? What's planted in the sidewalk that the bees are working? Then plant appropriate trees. If you want a tree for birds, plant an oak tree. It's great. 300 different soft-bodied insects on oaks. If you want it for bees, a lot of choices that you can plant, and encourage people to plant pollinator-friendly trees. If your choice is between an ornamental pear or a seven sons, choose the seven sons. Okay? Or between a flowering crabapple and a seven sons, choose a seven sons. Flowering crabs are in bloom when everything else is in bloom. Seven sons is in bloom. Nothing else is out there. And develop a 10% attitude, which is 10% of your property should be left alone or planted to pollinator plants. Okay.
Now I'll start running.
Yeah. Start running. Questions?
Okay. I'm gonna take this and go.
Mike, you mentioned that the Seven Sons tree is not available anymore in the wild.
Yes.
How would we go about acquiring such a tree?
They are
Hard to
available.
find?
They're still hard to find. I propagate them. And as fast as I can get them up to any size, they're gone. Very hard to obtain. Great Lakes Landscaping carries them. They're up in Cedar Springs. They carry them, but they're wholesale. You've got to get somebody to buy them. And boy, they know they're rare too. But if you can get a small shortly,
Ma'am, I'm gonna let-
and you know, I propagate them and grow them. There's some tricks to it. Yes.
What would you say about the Rose of Sharon? We get a lot of bees from that. on
Yep.
that.
Rose of Sharon, our native bees and our honeybees, they seem to like them. I don't know how productive they are, but they usually bloom in August. And I've got some great photos of native bees and honeybees just covered in pollen. There's so much pollen that they produce. But you know what? I think that they're strategic like the other plants, because certain times you go look and you won't find a single bee. Have you noticed that? Yeah, so I think they're allocating the resources, and I think that when they initially bloom in the mornings, you'll see bees all over them. After they're pollinated, I think they're just pretty to look at. Yes.
How do you propagate the rose of, not the,
Yep, Seven Sons.
Is it not like an acorn or something easy, is it?
No, the best way to do it is through cuttings.
Oh, so I can't go to Terry's and pick up acorns?
Yeah, you can. You can go and you.
Go pretty quickly, you know, you have to keep them trimmed really soon to get like a bush.
Yep. They want to be multi-stem. Cuttings is the best way. Yep. Softwood cuttings. Yes.
In those periods, you mentioned that sometimes there's just not enough bees.
Right.
Has there ever been any type of effort to harvest the nectar and the pollen and save it for, a time when in August or September or something like that?
You know, I don't know. The question is when we have a surplus of nectar and pollen, could it be harvested and saved for later in the season? I think the logistics of that would be really difficult. You know, what a beekeeper will do, like in the fall in September, is they begin to feed sugar water so that the bees fill up all the cracks and crevices with sugar water so they can get through. Then there are commercial pollen substitutes available that we can put on top of a hive. It's not as good as real pollen, but the bees can survive on it. So I would say probably not. It's probably cheaper and more cost effective to just use substitutes.
And also from Zoom, someone said Lowe's in Holland may carry the Seven Sons tree from Monrovia.
Who carries it?
Lowe's in Holland, they thought
What?
might have it.
Guess where I'm going?
Wow.
He said that Lowe's in Holland may have Seven Sons trees. If they've got them, get one. That's fantastic news. Yeah. There's a cultivar called Temple of Bloom. I can't propagate it, legally. You do what you want, but that's probably what they have for sale, is Temple of Bloom. If you can get one, get one.
So now I'm switching to the perennial garden a minute.
Yes.
What is it about sedum? Like I have autumn joy.
Yes.
What kind of bee is that? They swarm that plant
There are-
continually. Is that because of the seeds or?
No?
No.
You all could hear that question. She's wondering what type of bee is after the sedum in the fall. Autumn joy specifically. We'll have everything work in the autumn joy. We'll have bumblebees, we have honeybees, and we have a lot of the little natives. They're called megalochiles, and they're quite a small bee. Many different species within that group, and you'll see them working the sedum pretty, proficiently. Yeah, they like that. A lot of the native bees they're only out there for a couple of weeks, and then the rest of the time they're either a larva, a pupa, or a fertilized adult waiting for the next year to come.
But you don't get stung because I'm working in my.
Right.
They swarm away, so I never know what kind of bee is it. I tend to hesitate, but they swarm, but they'll just go away immediately if there's a person you work.
She said they don't sting you when they're working the flower, and that's generally true. When the bees are bringing in nectar and pollen, I rarely wear a veil or even gloves. I never wear gloves. And if there's a nectar flow or a pollen flow going on, they don't care about you. They don't care. Yeah. In fact, you're just.
Because I've heard if they sting you, some of them die.
If a honeybee stings you, that honeybee will die. That's correct. And when it stings you, it releases a pheromone, an attack pheromone, so that all the other honeybees in the area go, hey, and then they sting you. Because if you're a bear or a raccoon and you're getting into the hive, they want you out. And they will sacrifice their life. That's right. They all die. Yeah. You had a question?
Couple bee questions. You sort of
Okay.
answered the one. I was wondering about the lifespan of a bee. And you mentioned that the queens will lay eggs through November through January. When do they actually hatch then? Is it that mid-March?
The eggs hatch 3 weeks after they're laid. I'm sorry, the eggs hatch 3 days after they're laid. And then the baby bee emerges from the comb 3 weeks after that egg is laid. So when she starts to lay in January, we have baby bees 3 weeks later. And they'll spend the next 3 weeks inside the hive taking care of other bees.
And then, so when they're actually have a job flying outside, how long is that?
In the summertime, the average life is 3 weeks. Okay, so a bee lives about 6 weeks after it hatches. And those are summer bees. Winter bees that the queen will lay, they start out with the ability to store fat. They have fat deposits on their body, and they can live 6 months in the wintertime. So we have 2 different groups of bees. And actually, when the summer bees go out, they wear themselves out. They work themselves to death. They wear out their wings, and then they can't make it back to the hive.
Wow. You mentioned the varroa mite.
Yeah, varroa mite.
How do you get rid of that then?
There are
What's the treatment?
organic methods. There's no organic honey in the United States, by the way, but there are organic methods of treatment. And what I use oxalic acid. Oxalic acid is a naturally occurring acid in the beehive, and I will put it on a hot surface and I slide it underneath into the hive. And as the gas is given off by that hot oxalic acid, then if you're a mite, you let go. It bothers you, so you let go. And then the bees rush in and they grab you and they take you out. And you have to do that 3 or 4 times in the fall at once a week. That way, all the bees have the opportunity to lose their mites. And there are chemicals that you can use, regular insecticides that you can use, and I don't tend to use those. Sorry.
Yeah, I just had to put this plug out. I'm a children's librarian, and Candace Fleming just released a book this year about the honeybees. It's beautifully done, really simple, but great. She's a great researcher, great illustrations. And I think it might be called Honeybee, or what's their Latin name?
Oh, Apis.
Yeah, it might be called that.
Apis mellifera.
But anyway, Candace Fleming, if you want to get a
Yep.
really good book.
Yep. Thank you. Thank you.
I'm bringing it over.
I think you said that bees eat honey a couple
Yes.
of times.
Yes.
Is that their primary food source?
Bees have 2 food sources. The carbohydrate is only from nectar, which nectar is converted into honey. protein for a bee is only from pollen. They have no other source, but they're strict vegetarians. Wasp, on the other hand, their protein source is meat. So they eat spiders, they eat caterpillars, they eat that sandwich that you're holding in your hand. Bees don't do that. It's one of the distinctives between bees and wasps is their protein source. But yes, to answer your question, their only source of carbohydrate is nectar or honey. Yep. Or sugar water if the beekeeper gives it to them.
We've got time for about 2 more questions.
I was just looking up because Herrick Library is doing a giveaway on Arbor Day, Friday, as to what types. They are giving an eastern redbud, a white flowering dogwood, a sugar maple, or lilac trees.
Okay, lilac trees are not visited by bees. Occasionally you'll see a butterfly on one. The sugar maple, good source of nectar and pollen for a very brief period of time. They're normally in bloom for 4 or 5 days. The redbud is great. I like that one. And what was the fourth one? Flowering dogwood is the flowering dogwood is only pollinated by one particular native bee. Honeybees don't touch them. Bumblebees don't touch them. They're beautiful to look at. Just enjoy them because they're pretty, but not because you're helping native or honeybees, right? Eastern redbud. Yeah. Yeah. I do a talk on trees not to plant for bees and things like forsythia. They're wind pollinated. What's the point? You know, white flowering dogwood.
Isn't there a native dogwood that is more beneficial?
We have yes, to our native bees. Yes, but not the white flowering dogwood. Well, there's Kusa dogwood. Kusa is different from our American dogwood, and they will be visited by some of our native bees. But the American dogwood, which you'll see growing in the woods, it's basically not bothered by the bees at all. One native bee, and that's the Megalochili. Yep. I want to show one more thing if I can, Carol, and that is, was doing a job at a McDonald's a few years ago, and right across the fence was this beautiful, beautiful tulip poplar. It's over 100 feet tall. It's been there since the city of Wayland was even considered. It's a beautiful tree, and you can see the leaves in the front. You know, in front of this gal was working for me, great worker, and got this picture of the tree. There's the next day. Yeah, you have the same reaction I had. So there it is on Thursday, and there it is on Friday. So me being obnoxious, I went over and I asked, why did you cut that tree down? Well, we have orders to take every tree out from fence to fence because they're going to put in a gas station. This is the kind of stuff that we can stop. Had I known, I'm sure I could have talked to the developer and said, it's in the corner. It's not hurting anything. It's beautiful. It's been there 100 years. It's good for the pollinators. And he probably would have said, sure. But the guys out there clearing the lot to put in the speedway, and you know what they replaced it with? I don't know. Nope, I don't have a picture. They replaced it with 3 blue spruce. Blue spruce, disease-ridden, horrible, disgusting trees. And they removed a beautiful tree that was producing pounds of nectar every year, and they put in 3 blue spruce. Yeah, last question here.
The smoke tree?
Smoke tree,
Okay.
cotinus.
The same thing happened. There was a lot behind the mall here in Holland, and I just admired this beautifully huge smoke bush tree. And all of a sudden, it was gone last year. They just took it down. And I thought,
Yep.
okay, they're finally clearing this whole lot to build on. And no, that was the only tree they took down in the entire thing. I just was looking at it last night going, why would
Why?
they take this
Yeah.
beautiful, it's the biggest one I've ever seen. I don't know if they're pollinators or not, but it was the same storyline.
No, but they're pretty. They're really pretty. And it is a similar storyline. And often we can stop that kind of stuff because people don't want to take down pollinator plants. It's not like somebody's going, I hate pollinator plants or I hate trees. Nobody hates a tree. But the orders were clear it. Probably the same way with your smoke tree. Yeah, that's strange. Probably okay. Thank you. We're out of time.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you everybody for coming.
Okay.